All right, well, why don't we go ahead and get started? It's a little bit after 2, maybe a couple other people join us. Okay, it says it's being live streamed. We'll hope it is. So we've been having some live streaming issues yesterday and today. We don't know why. Trying to sort those out. So if we are live streaming to our public, welcome. This is the Oregon Department of Fish and Beaver Management Work Group. We're scheduled to go until 4 o'clock today, and thank you for joining us. And if it's not live streaming in the way we would like, the meeting is being recorded and will be posted.
Oh, Jamie, you're cutting out here.
And back in.
Oh, there you are.
There I am. Hopefully, I will continue. For introduce himself as a new member of the group, sitting in for Derek.
Jamie, so that was, oh, sorry, go ahead, Brian.
You kind of cut out, Jamie, but I think that was an introduction for me to introduce myself. I'm Brian Wolfer. I'm the game program manager in the wildlife division here for ODFW. And as such, that program includes the fur bear carnivore program, ungulates, game birds, and so kind of all game species. And I'll be sitting in for Derek while he's out.
I'm not sure why it's a problem. The other person I wanted to introduce, let's see, Greg, do you have an update for people?
You're on mute, Greg, sorry.
Okay. So yeah, I've been saying that I would be winding down with my commission appointment by the end of the year. And so it looks like it's actually bumped up a month, and I'm actually finishing them up at the end of this month. So this would be my last Beaver group meeting as a commissioner. Just want to let folks know, and I just appreciate the way everybody's been working so hard and hanging in there and taking the time that's needed to really have the best outcome that we can have. So thanks, everybody. That's it.
Okay, I've moved to a different location. Hopefully this will be better. So I don't think we have any other updates. And Sam, am I still coming through choppy?
It's a little bit better now. Hopefully this new location helps.
Yeah, thanks. So Zoom meeting tips, same as we've always used. So nothing new there. I'm gonna go ahead and go to the next one. Everybody's named themselves, so that's fine. Go ahead and go to the next one. And our agenda. So if you recall from our last meeting, we were focused in on developing we had some small group conversation. We had a large group report out. We assembled the Jamboard, and Sam and I spent a little time with that to reorganize it. We did not change any of the content on any of the little notes from the report outs from the groups. We also really appreciate all the group leaders who took the time to write notes and send them to us to make sure that the Jamboard accurately reflected what people were talking about. So that really helped. So thank you to everyone who took that extra time. And so we sent out a slightly reorganized Jamboard to all of you, so you could start to see how the ideas that are emerging start to group into possible recommendation categories, if you will. And we met with the subgroup 2 weeks ago, 1 week ago, 2 weeks ago. And shared with them the groupings and just where we were going.
Jamie, you cut out again there.
So, well, Sam, you'll just, if you could just pick up where I've left off if I've cut out too much. So today, I hope maybe I'll get off video for a minute. Sure that they're the right groupings, making sure people understand what's on the sticky notes, because we only did report outs the last time we didn't have any conversation about it. And so we want to, if you look at the agenda here, that we wanted to go around and hear from everybody their reflections on the Jamboard and any clarifying questions that they have about the ideas. So as you've taken a time to look at them on your own, if there are things that are like, who wrote this and where were they going with that? That's the kind of thing we want to capture. And so then we'll want to hear from everybody to do that. If we were doing this live, in a room together, we would have sticky notes and people would be able to put dots up. And people and then if we can identify any additional information needs that the group has and get a sense of kind of well, so that's the agenda. I think what I'm going to do is so I wanted to go ahead and do a round robin, have everybody go around and just share. And we said
I'm afraid when I speak, she'll come back. So I don't want to cut her off here.
Yeah, Sam, if you can finish explaining the agenda.
Yeah. So I'll try to pick up and fill in some gaps here. So we'll start by doing a round robin. So hearing from each person about any overall reflections on the Jamboard, as well as any kind of questions about the contents of the sticky notes. And so what we'll do is each person will have 2 minutes to share, or up to 2 minutes to share. And what we'll do is flag those sticky notes that have the questions. And then we can take some time to answer those questions. So if you were a contributor for that sticky note, you can jump in and say, hey, this is what I meant by education opportunities, for instance, and elaborate further where those questions exist. And then we put together a little Zoom poll that has just the category, the list of all the categories. And so we'll put that up on the screen. It will be automatic and you just have to click your top priority ideas and it'll be very straightforward, and we'll all do that together. And then we'd like to hear, if you have some rationale you'd like to share on why these categories are your top priorities, and we'll also try to capture that. And that will help to kind of document some criteria that we're all using, even or implicitly to make these decisions, and just make that explicit and share with the group. And then we'll also capture if there's any information gaps or data needs, and capture that as well. So if you say, well, I don't quite understand enough about X, Y, Z to really support that category, that's where we'll capture that kind of thinking. And then we'll move on to next steps at 3:45 and wrap up around 4 p.m. Any questions on that? No? All right, I think Jamie is back here, but we can just go ahead and go to the next slide, which is again a reminder of the meeting guidelines. And so if you can take a minute and look over these, that would be great. And specifically thinking about, you all have already come to the meeting prepared. You're here to fully participate. But if you can pay attention particularly to the balance of speaking times, it's a large group and we have a lot of folks we'd like to hear from and hear everyone's perspective. So if you could just keep that in mind as you're sharing the space and time with your fellow work group members, to try to keep the comments short and questions short so we can keep the group moving. And then of course, to participate in an open and mutually respectful way, realizing that you're all serving as a liaison to your larger communities, acting in good faith, and ideally leaving baggage at the door. All right, Jamie, are you back?
I'm here. I'm hoping that it's been resolved, but it does seem like there's a lot of gremlins in the works today.
Yes. All right, so I'll go ahead and put up the Jamboard. Get into that.
So when I missed Sam going through the agenda, I think that I'm sure that she did a perfect job. And so so we wanted to make sure we heard from everybody. And so we want to go around, and I will actually call on you and put a couple people on deck. And we really want to hear your reflections, observations about the Jamboard, just whatever those are. And then any questions that you have about some of the things written on the notes, or any of those questions, and we'll keep track of those. So we'll hear from everybody, and then we'll come back around and we'll start talking through some of those questions. The idea is to see that this becomes the emerging framework for a set of recommendations. And so we want to make sure people understand them. We want to start to refine them and work through those. Make sure we identify any additional information that people might need, or areas that we need to do some more work on. So that's the whole point of this exercise, and really to hear from everybody. So if folks are good to go, I'm just going to go ahead and I'll do 3 people. I'll put 1 person on and then 2 people on deck, so you know where you are. And Sam will be keeping a running list of the any questions. So I'm going to go ahead and start with our subgroup, actually, because they've looked at this a couple of times. Oh yeah, Lauren, yeah, Sam can send that out to you. So you've got it in your email as well. So I'm going to start with, who do I want to start with? How about Amy?
Oh, I hate being the lead off on these things, but maybe I can take other people's ideas. So my thoughts on this after going through the subgroup meeting too, and having the benefit of some expanded discussion around these, is honestly, we identified a little bit of what we saw as far as redundancy, and how redundancy can mean that it can lead us toward, that it's a consensus idea. But I think we need to approach consensus in each individual topic as well. And just because something is listed up here multiple times, we need to really suss out that consensus application on each one of these topics. The other aspect for me that, and I don't know if this goes, really is addressing what you guys were wanting to talk about at this juncture, but I think when we move forward on recommendations based on this Jamboard and these emerging ideas, it would be interesting to be able to utilize some kind of a scaled approach to statements to see where folks are at. So such as, I'm just going to attack the big one in the room with the limit and closures for trapping. If we started a scale of closures for trapping, I feel like the percentage for consensus is going to be lower. If we have that as a bullet point, and then perhaps You know, we're working on questions such as, you know, trapping closures in defined areas for defined timeframes with defined purposes, things like that, where we start getting into more of a specific example. We might find opportunity for consensus being higher in some of those things. So that's just an off the top view on that. I think that one of the big items here, obviously, is the landscape analysis area. And I think there was probably the most consensus around those kinds of things, or the most redundancy around those kinds of ideas. And I think one thing that we talked about in the subgroup committee that would be beneficial as well is what's to use, I don't know if this is a great phrase for it or not, but what's low hanging fruit? What can we look at where we have consensus? It's already within ODFW's purview, such as we wouldn't have to go through an entire rulemaking process. It's something we could implement and have quicker response times with outcomes. So those are my thoughts. I'm not sure how well that fit with what you were asking, but there you go.
Oh, that's fine, Amy. And were there any, when you took a deeper dive looking at individual sticky notes, were there any questions that came up or that you wanted to clarify with the full group? You mentioned one about kind of the, you know, scaling the statements.
Yeah, I think actually, I mean, I feel like I understand where everybody was coming from with their sticky notes. I do think on some of these, it will be interesting to see, you know, a blanket statement like closure of trapping, you know, on federal lands. You know, is there opportunity to scale that from whoever had put that out as the top goal for them? You know, that would be I think the biggest question for me.
Okay, thanks for that. Thanks, Amy. Okay, I'm going to go to Chris next.
Okay, thanks, Jamie, and thanks, Amy, for leading off. I'd say overall, looking at this board, it was an impressive collection of positive ideas, functional things that reflect all the discussions we've had for the last 6 or 8 months, however long we've been doing this. So that was very encouraging. I don't have any particular questions on any item. Be great to hear the discussion. Maybe then I'll have questions. But I think in order to use this long list, I think we're going to need to do some sort of prioritization, or at least grouping by, you know, I think Amy raised some options already, like easy to hard, or with or without rulemaking. And it'd be great to think about what those dimensions of that, so that we can scale them. You know, you know, if so something might be hard to do and require rulemaking, making it longer term, and some things might be easy to do without rulemaking or shorter term. And do we end up with subset lists where our final recommendations offer the option to choose from lists, turning this, rather than making this very one long laundry list, make some smaller sorted ones that help ease the potential implementation. That's it.
Thanks, Chris. Jefferson, and then Leland.
All right. I was excited to see all the topics that came up on the Jamboard, like Chris was saying. Just it's a good representation of everything that we've been talking about. And I definitely support Amy, you're leading off the bat and supporting what you're saying about that there are different levels of controversy about some of these things, and some of them are kind of easier. One of the things that we talked about that seemed really easy was just explaining better in the regulations about the predator status description was one of them. Not changing it legislatively or anything like that, just making it more clear to the regular person who's out there. And so I think, yeah, easy, medium, hard, and you know, it's kind of nice to be able to show this commission, this working group actually having some progress. And I think it's important that the working group does convey basically any progress, because I think this working group is really serving as a model of how we should discuss things. And so I'd like to show some consensus to begin with, and just kind of get us in the practice of having these conversations, and maybe we can work off those low-hanging fruit first and kind of work through them as we go along. In terms of categories, I think some of these are actually kind of supporting categories. And so like Chris was saying, and Amy alluded to, that basically the devil's in the details. And so saying something like trapping closure, that is not descriptive enough in its detail to really understand, to vote thumbs up or thumbs down on it. To, you know, there's a lot of nuance there that we need to talk about, and the concerns about like making sure things are monitored if we do closures and stuff like that. So some of these analyses, population and landscape analyses, I see as great supporting categories for other bullet points. One category, the funding habitat, the funding category, and specifically, if you look at all of those sticky notes, those are all about habitat. So when I was talking about habitat, I wasn't talking about funding necessarily so much as ODFW can use the funding of habitat restoration projects to benefit Beaver. Because it's easy to misconstrue that as like, well, everything that ODFW is going to do requires funding. That's not what any of those sticky notes are talking about. It's funding as a tool to direct improvements in habitat. And then the other thing that I'm want to remind us is that we are supposed to use best current existing science to make our decisions. And so when we're talking about doing analyses or data collection, in my mind, I'm seeing those paired with some sort of management actions that then they go on to inform, rather than that alone being the answer. So I think we have enough information to try some things, but we want to understand the implications of what we're trying. So
thanks, Jefferson. So Leland and then Brian P. We have two Brians.
Thanks. I don't have a bunch of questions. I feel like a number of these are fairly self-explanatory. You know, I'm going to reiterate what some of the others have said is, you know, kind of some of these blanket statements. That scaling could be really important. And then the other piece is, as we're looking at these, that considerization of kind of the metrics, how we measure any success and what the intent is. I mean, for things like, say, closure of trapping on public lands, that there should be a defined intent of what we're attempting to accomplish there, and then some way to measure the success of any of these various things. And of course, please choose closure because it's the big elephant in the room. But it goes for any of these, right? Whether it's a landscape analysis or research on limiting factors, those are generally looking for limiting factors. So there's an intent implied. But even things like adjusting the data collection process, making sure that we're very clear about that. And I'll shut up now.
Nothing like our dogs to keep us within our time limits, huh? We'll have to hear back from Leland when he comes back. Brian P.
Sure. Yeah, hi, everybody. Good to see you all. And let's see, I guess I would say that, I think the most of the proposals and ideas that I've heard seem to have bubbled up from the small groups and made their way onto the Jamboard. Not surprisingly, some description of a closure on federally managed public land came out of most, if not all, of the small groups. And I know, as others have said, that's a controversial issue, and that there are the proposals on here range from controversial to not so much. We sort of have to decide how to approach those. My view is that at some point in this process, we need to put the closure idea on the table and give everybody a chance to, if you're for it, to make your pitch and all the rationales you see. And if you're against it, what the reservations are, and have a chance to talk about that. I just think we really need to do that. And my preference would be to get to it sooner rather than later, and then see where we are, and then move from there into some of the less controversial things. I do realize that there wasn't enough consensus around it to adopt the rulemaking petition, but I think maybe a lot's changed since then, and it would be good to check in with everybody on it. And in terms of the changes, I would say just there's kind of been more conversation, more science. We have now that private forest plan that is using is better protecting beavers, and we should talk about that at some point. And then I'm seeing it in other places too, like in the South Coast Conservation Plan from the department talks about working more with beavers. So I just feel like there's some momentum there, and maybe folks aren't necessarily where they all were prior to convening the group. And like others, I think I understand what all these proposals are suggesting, and don't really have any questions. Sorry if I took too long.
Thanks, Brian. So I've got Josh, and then I'm going to put Scott B on deck.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. Appreciate it. And I'm just going to echo, I wasn't able to attend the last meeting, and so I was really pleased to see this list of emerging ideas being, for the most part, quite reasonable and well rationed. I definitely agree with the discussion around framing some of that limited closure and trapping around specific issues and or resource limitations associated with beaver, especially as it relates to recovery of ESA listed species. So I agree with the discussion around getting to this trapping closure perspective and discussion sooner rather than later, being that that's the heart of the matter, and refining the scope of potential recommendations, I think, is important. The other one I would say is the funding piece is really critical, and those 3 sticky notes are really related just to the state of Oregon funding. The landscape analysis and collaboration really point to the myriad of different land ownerships that are involved in providing beaver habitat. And so, there might be some potential to broaden that out, interagency collaboration, sharing of resources to address mutually identified resource or research or monitoring questions that are out there, so we can kind of leverage multiple funding sources, because just working for a federal agency, land management agency that is frequently short of funding, pooling money is really key for getting effective broad scale monitoring done, and analysis as well. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks, Josh. Scott, and then Jimmy.
I feel like Brian and Josh just gave my remarks for me. I would echo what both of them said. I believe that as ecosystem engineers, beavers need more protection rather than less. I too agree that we need to talk about closures. I have spoken with quite a few people, both personally and on my social media, with whom I've shared you know, my thoughts about beavers. And you'd be amazed how many people believe that beavers are protected as our state animal. And when I tell them that they are legally classified as a predatory animal that can be killed willy-nilly by anyone, you know, just, you know, under a broad range of circumstances, people are really appalled. And I'm not talking about people that, you know, that necessarily share my strength of convictions on issues like animal welfare. But they're just, you know, and so I believe that if we are in this exercise to try and formulate policies that align with the values of most Oregonians, I think most Oregonians want to see more protections given to these animals. I think people do have a good understanding that they are ecologically significant. And I think that most Oregonians would say that they should be reclassified and they should be protected from trapping, and so I think that needs to be reflected in our final product. So thank you for giving me the chance to talk.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. And I want to clarify for the group, Scott is Brian P's alternate, but Scott is here as the primary for Danielle, who's not here today. And Jimmy, I called on you, but I was erroneous because you are an alternate. And we have, who are you an alternate for?
Leland.
Leland, right. And Leland is here. So I'm going to pass over you, Jimmy, and go to Darren.
All right, sounds good. I wasn't surprised at all by any of the emerging ideas that came out. It's exactly what I thought was going to come out of it. The ones that I want to key in on that are extremely important in my eyes would be the population data collection. Since as a federal biologist, we work off of best available science, I want to make sure that we are able to get that for this so we can use that for management options later down the road. And then another one that is right in my wheelhouse since I am a wildlife biologist for the Bureau of Land Management and we're starting to use beaver for restoration projects. I want to make sure that it's extremely important that we know that we need to have that tool in the toolbox, that we can have closures in the areas that we're doing relocations with beavers, because that would be really counterintuitive to be able to put beavers into an area and still have that available for trapping in that area. So that's the one thing that I want to key in on there. And I just want to say everybody's doing a great job with this and I really appreciate it. So thank you.
Thanks, Darren. Let's see. Stan, how about we hear from you and then Samantha?
Thank you. It's interesting to see. I think that you can see everybody's point of view here on just what they've said in the last few minutes, those who want trapping closed and those who do not. I'm going to read through a list that I made, and we've yet to see any peer research. We talk about all the best available science, but show it to us, please. It shows us a documentation that even remotely identifies that current beaver harvest management programs are posing significant risk to long-term beaver population viability. We've yet to see a population risk factor analysis, science-based assessment, in other words, ranking of risk, where trapping or whether disease or predation. No public land predation discussion on resident or translocated beaver. I could go on, I've got a whole list here. One really important thing is the BRAT model. Does the BRAT model actually apply to Western Oregon? I know it can be used elsewhere in drier climes, but does it really actually work for Western Oregon? So I'm hearing already that we have to ban beaver trapping to have more salmon, but yet we aren't showing us any correlations that the regulated harvest that we currently have is having any impact or negative impact on salmon restoration. So, you know, as far as the population data collection, OTA is the one that said, hey, these are we're very willing to do these different tabulations that would help us. But we have, not to beat up on our federal managers, but we've had closures for years that you haven't monitored. So now we're asking for additional closures and additional monies to monitor. Too many questions for us to really think that there's emerging processes towards a regulatory, end game here so far for us from the OTA standpoint. Thank you.
Thanks, Stan. And it would be helpful, Stan, if you can send us that list of the additional information needs, because that's the other piece that we are trying to suss out.
Can do.
Samantha.
Thanks, Jamie. Yeah, I echo what a lot of other people are saying, that I think it's that we do need to lean into the hard conversation around limiting and trapping closures. And I think that's really important for us to tackle today. I'd really like to see that looked at within the light of the climate policy within ODFW's mission statement, which is to benefit the current and future generation of Oregonians, manage wildlife in such a way, and that doesn't just include hunters and trappers. And then also within the lens of the Oregon Conservation Strategy. So I think keeping those three things in mind. The climate policy also states we should use the precautionary principle. And I think that's important as we look at limiting trapping, that we look really at the precautionary principle and how we can proceed forward. So that's my input. I don't have any questions on the post-its. I think we all, at this point, we know where each of us are kind of coming from. So I echo others on that as well. And that's all I have. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Sam. I'm going to loop back and get Leland, who's back with us and wanted to finish his thoughts.
Yeah, sorry about that. I had some maintenance folks show up right in the middle. Dogs didn't like it very much. And I kind of forget where I ended off, but I think if we can really be focusing on measuring what we're trying to accomplish, and there's really good science available around trapping. It's well established within wildlife management science. And if we're looking at this using, really intentional effort to figure out how to apply this to create the changes that we're looking for is going to be important. And that's important from a number of places, right? I mean, one being funding. Funding's so critically important for conservation, and we're often very restricted on available funding. So being really conscientious about how we're applying this and how we're working through this process, I think will be useful both for the commission and for the department in moving forward. There does seem to be some consensus around some of the population data collection and landscape analysis. And I just wanted to echo what Amy and Jefferson and Chris all said, which was, building out the metrics of how we're looking at where things are coming to consensus, how folks with very different perspectives around wildlife, where they're on the same page is a really valuable thing. And then looking at kind of short-term success, long-term success is going to be pretty powerful for the commission to be able to look at and understand where they can have some hopefully fairly quick turnaround to apply management in a way that gets to the benefits that folks are looking for, but also fulfills kind of their statutory regulatory requirement. So I think maybe I'll finish it there. I think I hit all my points, but like I said, I kind of lost track of where I was. So appreciate the chance to finish up.
Okay, thanks, Leland. Let's see, Wayne, and then Boone.
I mean, you're muted there, so hopefully you can click that little red microphone on the bottom left. There you are.
Hey, sorry about that.
No
Sorry
worries.
about my barking dog too. That was a surprise. I was going to kind of drift off to the side and start talking a little bit about water. And you know, it's nice, all the good ideas that we've got here, but you know, Boone and Bob and I used to, years ago, we started working with people about water and about how we can make differences on the landscape with water and bringing systems back and looking at what the opportunities are and just little things that a lot of them hadn't been seen before. And things like plants, which I've talked about plants before, but plants that can get roots way down. And when they do that, they can take water way down. And when they do that, they can build up water reserves around the roots of some of these plants. And when we get more water and in different places than we've had in the past, then we can make a lot more opportunities show up with all the things that have already been talked about. And we seem to be starting right in the middle of what we want to do instead of starting at the front. And I just would like to maybe talk about that a little more sometime. But I think we have a lot of opportunities to get things done through groups that we can go to. And we did it, you know, 30, 40 years ago. And people really caught on, ranchers and just all kinds of people. And water, I think, will be the one thing that might get us started in some areas that we really haven't, well, we just haven't done as thorough an area for me anyway. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, that's fine. It's fine, Wayne. I mean, everybody's contributing, you know, through their lens and through their expertise, and yours is definitely around the water. So appreciate that. How do we go to Boone?
Well, it's always nice to follow my hero, Wayne Elmore. You know, nobody makes better sense about things than managing riparian zones than Wayne. And last week, and sorry I missed the last meetings, is I was at the Climate Change Summit in Glasgow, Scotland. And a lot that went on there actually hits several of the aspects of the emerging ideas there. But sad to say, not everything is on this page. And one, you know, clearly should be the role that agencies like Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife can play in nature-based solutions to climate change. And this is going to be something that ODFW really needs to carry the mantle, I think, in the near future of both climate change mitigation, having actions that are going to be sequestering more carbon on the landscape, something that you would see in the riparian zones with healthy beaver populations, and climate adaptation, which gets back to what Wayne was just saying about water. You know, the presence of beaver while we know that the population is fine, but functionally, as their ecological role on the landscape, they're limited. We know that. I mean, the science is very clear on that. And so therefore, you know, we don't need to talk about population. We need to talk about the functional role of them on the ecosystem. And so, but with all of that in mind, you know, the elephant in the room, most of these are pretty soft and squishy, except for the closure on trapping. That's where we need to be focusing, I think, more of our time. So with that, thank you.
Thanks, Boone. Lauren?
Well,
and then, I'm sorry, Lauren, and then I wanted to put either Kevin or Shannon on deck, depending on who's who's available. Go ahead, Lauren.
Well, I guess I would say, looking at this, I think it would be important under education to maybe include something about why we manage beavers and the potential conflicts to public and private infrastructure from beaver activity. I think that is really important in the risk of flooding and damage. And then also, I think in all of this, it's important to note that while I understand the desire to of some groups to limit closure and trapping on federal lands, that any sort of potential conflict or consequences from beaver activity on federal lands, it doesn't just stay within those boundaries. And we see that with lots of other things, that if there are issues or flooding or things, that doesn't necessarily just stop at the line of, the property line of the federal lands. It can go into private property and other places. And so it does have an effect downstream. And so I think that that's also important to note, and that's why we have concerns in those areas. But I do think that education on reasons for beaver management, and also that when we do manage aquatic rodents, it's not like we can put a sign out. I had a farmer tell me this: I can't put a sign out that says nutria only. And so there's some conflict there about how, when we do manage aquatic rodents, how do we differentiate between different rodents in the same habitat that are causing similar damage.
Thanks, Lauren. Kevin or Shannon, whichever one of you is available, and then Tom or, I think Tom or Matt. Are both of you here? Yeah, Tom is here. So Kevin or Shannon. Yeah, there you are.
Yep. I can just kind of give some overview. As a kind of full team, we definitely downloaded after the last meeting, and overall, I'd say we were really pleased that, with so much of the overlap from each of the small groups, and probably just some real, in this process we're doing, this discussion and the prioritization. Really, that's a place where that's the whole reason the work group is kind of convened with each of the members. So really for ODFW, we're just in this process really need to play that role of stepping back, listening to the reasoning behind why each of the work group members, feel that one priority over another. Hear that reasoning, that helps make some decisions in the future, as well as just provide for us to provide clarifications when questions come up. Really not the place for us to interact in this prioritization process. And so I just wanted to kind of, just put that there, Jamie, that really, really appreciate this discussion, but also want to make sure we stay in our lane for the group being able to formulate what they were convened for.
Thanks, Kevin. So Kevin, given that, I was going to have Brian and Tom give them a chance to weigh in. Are you saying that maybe we shouldn't, or?
Yeah, the only thing I'd say, if they had a clarification on, they each had individual participation in the work groups. So if they needed to clarify some of the work group conversation, that certainly is applicable. For me, I was in a group with Brian Posewitz and Amy Patrick, and don't really have any clarification from me, just because it was good, full discussion. And I think the notes that Amy sent in were spot on. So thanks, Jamie.
Okay, Kevin. So Brian, I had Tom and Brian in that order. So I'm going to go shift to Tom and see if Tom, did you have anything to add?
No, I don't really have anything to add. I agree with Kevin in terms of, I think this is a really good start, nice grouping of actions and activities in the larger categories. I see some redundancy and interconnection between them, but I think it's a really good start. I don't have anything to add on our unless there are questions on anything our small group had.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Brian, I know you weren't a part of the conversation that created all of this, but is there anything you want to add?
Thanks, Jamie. No, I wasn't part of the conversation that had it, and I just kind of reiterate what we heard both from Kevin and Tom. Some really great things here that came out of the groups. It's exciting to see kind of how this is growing, and really kind of looking forward to playing that technical role of helping the group figure out just how some of these things are going to work, or how the agency can implement certain ideas as they come out.
Okay, thanks, Brian. And now I'm going to turn to Greg and Jill and Becky. And Jill, I understand you're a alternate for Greg, but I think it'd be important to hear for everybody to hear from you as well. So Greg, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree. So I agree with most of what's been said. I like the idea of scaling or prioritizing the clusters within clusters and among clusters. And I mean, there could be a sequence of, within first and then between, but there could be some kind of cross fertilization between the clusters that could end up prioritizing, in the final analysis, if that makes sense. So I think this has already been said, but a couple of times, but I would caution us not to automatically move certain issues off the table just because they're more challenging or contentious. And remember the question that initially came to our commission that we have to respond to when it's time to make a decision. If we end up stuck, on those hard questions, that hard question that's before the commission, that we can make some more general, easy to agree on concepts or actions that can be brought before the commission. And hopefully that's not perceived by our public that we're responsible for listening to, that we're just kicking the can down the road. And I agree with Kevin's comment, the stay in the lane comment. I think that applies to our commission as well. I mean, our other commissioners could comment on that, but I've said that's what I feel my role is really as an observer and watching the process move along. So other commissioners can comment on that as well. But that's all I have to say for now.
Thanks, Greg. Jill?
Okay, and my internet was having problems too, so I took off my video. I think this is a really good way to lay out all the different aspects of this. And I agree with Greg that I'm more listener, learning, and I do have some ideas, but I want to see how the group can move together to merge some of these together. I think there's very good ideas here on working with identifying beaver landscape areas, collaborating with federal agencies and private industries and individuals, which some of our field biologists are doing already, and learning more about the impact of harvest on beavers, particularly beavers that make ponds. So I'm here to listen and also take over after Greg, which I will miss Greg a lot, not just in this, but in all of his great information that he's provided over the last year and a half.
Thanks, Jill. And Becky, you're our last one.
Okay, thank you. I'm just looking forward to us moving forward and seeing where the process goes from here. I think that it's nice to see the Jamboard, all the different ideas, the breadth of what people are thinking about in terms of beaver. And I see a lot of opportunity for good things in this. And I'm listening and watching, and let's go forth.
Great, thanks for that, Becky. So I really appreciate everybody being so succinct and being so honest about, just your reflections to this. There is a lot that's positive about this, and there are some real challenges for us to unpack for sure. And so if we were in a big room together, we would have, the next step would be we would give people, some dots, and we would have people put dots on this board so that we could start to focus in, what are the top ones that we need to be spending our time with? Where do we start is basically what it is. What are people's priorities? And it's not to say that others go away. It's just to give us a sense of, where do we want to start the conversation to start to get into the level of detail within each one of these categories. And so as a substitute, it's a little bit of a poor substitute, but it's the best we can do in the virtual environment. Within Zoom, we can do a poll, just an informal poll. And Sam has it all set up, ready to go. And what will happen is it'll just appear on the screen, and you can just choose. And Sam, we have it set up so they can choose 3, right?
Yep.
Yeah. And so it'll be really clear. The poll will come up on the screen. You just choose 3. We'll get results in real time. And then we can just take a step back and look and see. And it's not to say, we're not voting on which one is, which ones we want to elevate. It's a way to just get a sense of the group's priority of, where to start the conversation to focus in on. So that's what we're doing. So if you could choose your top 3 on this board, the poll is up. You just click the ones and then click submit, and then we'll gather all of that, and then we'll take a step back and go from there. So you have a little poll up on your screen. You just choose 3, and then you click submit. So we've got 9, 10. You can start to see right in real time, kind of where people are at. Got 14 of 22 people doing it. So if the remaining folks can do it, we can get a good sense of where we're at. Looks like we're stopped at 15. Not sure if ODFW staff and commissioners were doing it, or we're at 16.
Hey, Jamie, this is Kevin. We were going to let that kind of prioritization be organic. So
yeah, okay.
Yeah, so Brian, Tom, and I were not putting.
Or Matt. So Brian, Tom, Kevin, okay. Matt.
Yep, sorry about that. I didn't see that.
Okay, yep. So that I was just doing the numbers in my head to make sure where we are. All right, so then this is everybody. Okay, so Sam, we can keep this up on the screen, right? Does it stay on for a certain amount of time?
Yeah, so I just closed it, so no more voting, and you should be able to see the results here.
Yeah, and if you go to the side, there's a little gray bar. If you click on that, you can scroll up and down, and then you can see all of it. And Sam, can you actually capture this and make it so that we can put it on we can share it in a different,
Yeah, absolutely.
That way we can refer to it while we're sharing. So, and while Sam is doing that, I mean, just a little back of the napkin observation from what we're seeing here. So it looks like folks really want to start talking about the population data collection, the landscape analysis to prioritize areas, and the limit closure trapping. Those come out as the top 3 areas to really start to focus in on. And some of the bottom ones are moving beaver and funding, collaboration. Those 3 are kind of in the bottom 3. So what that just tells me is that those are the ones that we can sort of set aside for, you know, maybe a later conversation, but really the discussion we should focus in on is the landscape analysis to prioritize areas and the population data collection and the limit closure trapping. And it's nice because those 3, you know, really do lend themselves. Stan sent me his list of a number of, you know, information areas that Stan, you know, you were interested in. And a lot of that has to do with, you know, how do we know, I mean, how do we know the scale of the problem now? You know, how do we know enough to know where we prioritize areas, you know, if we were to close or limit? And so there's some, you know, there's some connection between these, you know, these 3 topics. So Sam, can we, are the group ready to take this down? Are we ready to put it on a screen to share, Sam?
So I am happy to copy and paste it here. Sure.
Yep. And then I was just going to close it on my screen. Super tiny. Yeah, maybe just make it as big as you can so we can just look at it. All right. So Jimmy, I see your hand up. And as an alternate, we generally don't take questions and conversation from our alternates during our meeting when the primary is there. So, because Leland is the primary, unless Leland stepped away. Leland's there.
I'm actually running into some problems here, so if Jimmy could take over, I'd really appreciate it.
Right, thanks Leland. Just wanted to check in with you on that. Jimmy, what's your question?
Yeah, thanks Jamie. I have a question about the process. A lot of these different items shouldn't really stand alone, especially as we're developing as a group to make recommendations. For example, without research or with research, you need funding, and you should do that in collaboration with others. And it should be done, in this case, at a landscape scale, as a lot of people have mentioned. So is there a point where some of these are going to start coming together where they should be? And will there be another vote then on prioritization? I'm asking because I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good question. And you know, in the way this works, I mean, we really, and we put it all out there, we start to organize it, we start to see what this looks like in terms of a framework, and then we take a deeper dive into each one of these categories and start, you know, talking about it and figuring out, you know, what is more information that we need about that, you know, how does it connect to other areas? You know, are there some, you know, sort of clear recommendations that can start to emerge? It's really a little bit more of an organic process, but I think you're right. I mean, these aren't necessarily standalone. It's more a way to sort, you know, where the group is at right now. So we have, you know, we've got 4 meetings worth of work to do to start to get to a level of detail within these categories, you know, that makes sense. And the areas where we can't get to detail, you know, are areas where we need more information, and that can be part of your recommendations too. Your recommendations can say, hey, you know, we can't move forward on this idea because we need this information, and so our recommendation is that we get it. So that's just an example of, you know, kind of how we start to work through this. Jefferson?
Yeah, I just wanted to agree with Jimmy on that. because I was having difficulty choosing what my top 3 were, because there's so much overlap that any of these actions are not an either or. They're in some way, it's more of a dial of how they all interact. So that is part of the complication and part of the benefit of being able to have ODFW work as a leader in the state, of kind of spearheading anything that's recommended, because this is a holistic approach. Like actually Jimmy said before the previous meeting, that you can't just do part of something. These all support or inform other parts of the overall. So a little more complicated, but definitely something to keep in mind.
Thanks, Jefferson. Samantha, rather.
It doesn't matter. Either way works. Yeah, I just am curious, if we are looking at this as to, what can ODFW do now? Are we looking at solutions as far as, what can we do quickly and immediately? And then looking at broader studies and, using that precautionary principle to decide what can we do quickly and immediately. I was just curious about that as we go forward, kind of filtering through the top 3 ideas.
Yeah, we've talked about that in the subgroup too. And I think that the recommendations, and you've heard some of it today, that I think the recommendations will fall within some sort of time scale, and or priority scale. So they could go together. So time scale could be such that there are some things that the group recommends these are kind of these are immediate things or short-term things. Here's some midterm things because there's some uncertainty. Here's some long-term things, once we have better information or data, and we're able to, or funding or whatever it takes to do some of those longer-term things. So that's one way that it could fall out. In terms of, you think about things that are not just short term, but things that are like easy. I mean, the low hanging fruit, or like Jefferson's example of clarifying language or tightening something up. So there's a number of ways to kind of slice sort of what comes in that first group, second group, third group, or even if you want to do it that way. So what Sam is doing right now is she took the poll down and she's putting some numbers next to the headings so that we can remember where we were. But I was struck by that the landscape analysis to prioritize areas came out as the number 1 that people wanted to focus on. And so I'm wondering if, for people that prioritize that one, what was the rationale that you used for, to have that be in your top 3? And that will get at, Sam, some of what you're talking about, which is, are these the things that, are these easy things? Is this, whatever the criteria is that you use in your head to choose that. So Sam, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, this Sam, right? Or other?
yeah, you Sam, sorry. That's why I stumble a little bit.
No, I just wanted to see too, because with the Zoom survey, we couldn't rank in order. We could just put the 3 ideas that were most interesting to us. Mm-hmm. And I know that all of us said qualitatively, today that we wanted to talk about the limiting and trapping closures. So I just want to make sure that we take that into account as we move forward with discussions without getting bogged down too much. Maybe we all can agree on landscape analysis and prioritization, but the trapping closures will be kind of the tougher conversation that until we have it, I don't know if we can really move forward to the other conversations. It's tough to keep the elephant in the room, as Leland said earlier, and then start having these other conversations.
Mm-hmm. Jefferson?
Yeah, I mentioned something along the lines of that some of these categories are sub bullet points that inform other things. And I voted for landscape analysis to prioritize areas. That has a lot that helps inform and are those devils in the details kinds of things about everything else. So if we're not looking or assessing the success or impact of any management changes in these ways, then it's a little disingenuous to the conversations that we've had before about moving forward in an informed way, and that that this really informs us about how we're doing with our management decisions once we've taken them. So and it allows for the flexibility of that management to be on various meaningful scales and to be adaptive on various meaningful scales. So just want to remain true to some of those earlier conversations.
Thanks, Jefferson. Amy?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think the top three that have come up, obviously, you know, as we look at these and the next ones on kind of on the rung there, you know, they're all tools, right? They're all tools to accomplish beaver management and the broader scale of beaver management that we're trying to look at here. And I think that, you know, my initial thing is to say, oh, you know, we need to look at these as kind of even and not get wrapped around the axle on certain things. But I also understand and respect the fact that, you know, we are going to have the hard conversation, right, about the trapping closures. And I think that we've all been in these meetings long enough, staring at each other on these little squares, that we know that that's just something that's going to happen, you know, need to happen. And maybe this is the meeting that we just say, we'll take on that conversation. And, you know, in the last full meeting in my subgroup with Brian and Kevin, you know, Brian brought that up as one of the recommendations of moving forward towards recommendation. One of his recommendations as to moving forward with our recommendations was that, you know, everybody was going to need to be heard. We were going to have to set aside time to have the hard conversations. And I really agree with what he said there. And we have kind of danced around this, you know, here and there a bit. And perhaps it is just not that necessarily in my mind prioritizes that topic above the other two that were highlighted here, but it is the one where we have the most contention around, and maybe we just need to acknowledge that and then kind of work our way through that.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Amy. And I have to say, you know, I've got there's two schools of thought here. I mean, one, so we've got probably about a half an hour of discussion time left for the meeting today. I mean, our meeting ends at 4, but we've got, you know, probably about 10 minutes or so of wrap up stuff to do. So we've got about a good half hour. So it sounds like that there's a lot of interest in starting to talk about the limit closure trapping topic. And I guess my caution would be that we not come out swinging. You know, that we come at it from a, you know, what questions do you have for each other about that topic? And what is some information, you know, is there information that people would want us to bring back that would help with this conversation? But come at it from a questions of each other. Yes, thank you, Amy. It's true. But, you know, if anybody was at the Trap Check meeting yesterday, that was tough. That was a really hard meeting. So yeah, we're all grown-ups and we know how to have these conversations. But I guess what I'm asking all of you is that you come at it from an inquiry perspective as opposed to a positional perspective for this first pass. If people would like to start with that topic. And I mean, it sounds like there's go ahead, Stan. I don't know which one was first, Stan or Becky. Go ahead, Stan.
Well, you know, I did send you those talking points that OTA's kind of been working on, and you know, we've watched this whole thing dance around what the petition's main focus was for months now. So I'm kind of glad we're getting to this hard point. Sad that we are, sad that a historic wildlife management practice is receiving what I feel is unfair scrutiny, but that's my perception. And I know there's others here that disagree totally, and that's fine. That's how work groups are supposed to be. But I really do think, Jamie and Samantha, that the questions that we've posed here, I hear, you know, different things about precautionary principles, but yet with that same principle, in that same definition of precautionary, we're not hearing about a risk analysis. And so what level of risk does our current management program have to all of these other benefits that we want Beaver to provide? And I think that question has to be the forefront before we start talking about whether we ban trapping on federal lands. What is the level of risk that the current Oregon Beaver Management Program has to these other beneficiaries of abundant beaver populations? And then we can talk about where we go from there. But we haven't had that analysis yet. Or if we have, I'm not intelligent enough to understand it. But I just seems to me it's missing. Thank you.
Yeah, Stan, thanks for that. And Sam is going to put up, Sam is going to put up on the screen sort of a running list of questions related to the limit and closure. Some of them, Stan, have come from you and some have come from others because we've been capturing them all along. And so so as we go through this discussion about it, we've got a list that we're populating. So Becky, you're next.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to pop in here and say that I am really appreciating this process as it unfolds. And it seems like it goes up and down, up and down. Sometimes I feel good about it, and sometimes I leave these meetings not feeling so good about it, but they seem to be kind of on some sort of a trajectory, including this little vote that we just did. And I think, like, it's unclear to me what having a conversation about no trapping on federal lands or limited trapping or continuing to trap. I mean, I feel like we already are pretty clear on where everybody's views on that are. And we have this opportunity to look, for example, at landscape scale and some of the learning we've already had, right? About what were some of the conditions that were in place in order for beaver to be really successful on the landscape. What are we learning about that through this process? What are the things that we're curious about in terms of population and what is missing there? That came up as number 2, that we do need more data. So, I mean, I just think it's what I'm trying to say, Jamie, is I sort of am just somebody here saying, I support your process. And I'm not really sure that anybody reconfirming how they feel, whether they're pro trapping on federal land or not, really, I don't know where that really gets us in this moment. So I'm for the process is what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Becky. And I think, I asked the question not about how you feel about closures or not, and clearly people are going to share that anyway, but really, I mean, that's why we put up this running list of questions. It's just like, if a recommendation is going to come out that there's a limit or a closure of trapping on federal lands, I mean, I think, Stan asked the overriding question of, how do we know, what do we know about how current regulated harvest is impacting what we want to see happen on these lands? So that's, that's a question. How do we know, where to limit, when to limit, which for how long? Is it limits on all trapping? Is it some kind of trapping? I mean, I think there's a lot to unpack there, because trapping includes research, trapping for data collection. There's a lot there. So I think that's what we're trying to get underneath. So I'm going to stop talking because I see 5 hands up now. So Jefferson.
Yeah, I just want to say in terms of risk analysis, the risk involved of not doing something is the absence of the potential benefits that we've all been talking about. And so the benefits of changing things then get weighed versus the benefits of the status quo of what's going on now. So like Ernie, who sadly isn't here today, has provided tons of economic analysis of the potential benefits, and the science group has put forward papers that have been distributed to describe the benefits of trapping bans or trapping closures, excuse me, in other areas, and how those have worked. And when it comes down to these discussions, it often is, well, you say this and then I say that, and then we may not really get anywhere. And that's why we keep referring back to that precautionary principle, because the precautionary principle is a mandate policy for ODFW that says in their writing they shall, when there are questions that are kind of not finalized or that are in debate, that they will choose the conservation approach. And so the scientific group has put forward a lot of papers and such. So in looking at things moving forward, I think it's fair to ask that, given that ODFW has to follow that climate policy and the precautionary principle, and given that their mandate, their mission statement is to consider current and future generations of all Oregonians, and given the Oregon conservation strategy, that we should be considering these questions in that light, and that it's not a question of why should we change or defend why we should change, but to defend why things should stay the same. Because I think we've shown enough evidence to show that things aren't right, and that that we should. That's what the real question should be.
All right, Jefferson. I'm going to get to other people in the queue, and then we'll see where we're at. Jimmy.
Hi, thanks. So I'm not going to, give my opinion on trapping versus not trapping and all of that. I'd just like to remind the group that if you're proposing to ban trapping on all federal lands in Oregon, you're taking the land managers out of the equation. And I don't see that the secretaries of agriculture or interior are asking for this. I don't see that, the directors of all of the national forest and BLM lands in Oregon and national parks and other federal lands are asking for this. Although under the current situation, the current regulations and rules and all that we have in place now, those land managers in Oregon can do that. And some of them have done that. There have been closures for a number of decades. That doesn't prevent others from asking for those and possibly getting those from ODFW after some analyses are done. So I'd like to remind everyone that if you're asking for closure on all federal lands, you're bypassing a lot of managers and not allowing them to weigh in, give their opinion, and do their jobs.
Thanks, Jimmy. Chris?
Yeah, thanks. I guess I just wanted to take a slightly different tact on this and remind all of us that there are two flavors of using trapping as a wildlife management tool. And I think Leland said, maybe Stan said too, that this is an important wildlife management tool. But another important wildlife management tool are trapping closures. And Oregon is probably the best example of that, closing trapping to beaver in the 1890s and not reopening it until the 1950s to achieve watershed health benefits. And so that wasn't trying to take away opportunities from hunters and trappers. That was doing wildlife and habitat management. So trapping closure is a wildlife management tool. And what we're asking is that be in the repertoire, right? Is that appropriate to be in the repertoire? And whether it's federal or not lands, as Jimmy pointed out, this is lands that are in the state of Oregon, and the resource is managed by ODFW. And does the situation warrant that wildlife management tool, trapping closure, get applied in some way in this situation? Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. Amy?
Yeah, I had a couple notes here that I wanted to surface real quick. You know, one thing that I would say that, you know, in Jefferson, what Jefferson was saying about the evidence that's been shown, you know, and that the subgroup has come up with, and then also a lot of our guest speakers have brought forward, to me, really seems to more zero in on habitat needs and why not for beavers being successful on the landscape. And so I don't want that to get lost in the conversation, because I think overwhelmingly the evidence has been more habitat driven than showing that that trapping has been the limiting factor in beaver mortality. And there are a lot of gaps that we haven't talked about when we talk about mortality for the population. You know, we really haven't talked a lot about the mortality aspect of things and where trapping fits into that. And so I think that is maybe one of those knowledge gaps that we do need to address at some point and delve a little bit deeper into that conversation. The other thing I would say is, you know, the climate policy is referenced a ton. And, you know, there's a lot more to this than the one bullet item for the precautionary approach. But yet that's what we, you know, are continuing to hear brought up. And, you know, there's also the sentence right, you know, a page or so before the precautionary approach that says the department should conduct ongoing research to reduce key uncertainties related to the response of fish, wildlife, and their habitat to climate and ocean change. So as much as there's a precautionary approach, there's also a call for research. And the precautionary approach itself also has a caveat in there about when faced with scientific and management uncertainty. So, you know, if we're going to invoke the climate policy, I think we need to really understand it. And it may be beneficial at some point to even have, I think it's Sean Clemens, who was the main drafter of this, you know, come in and do some kind of a presentation for us over the course of these next couple of meetings about when this was drafted, you know, how it was intended to be used and not used in wildlife management. And so I just think there's a lot more to that policy than we hear when we just hear the precautionary rule. And then the last bit that and if this is a pulling the pin on a hand grenade, Jamie, I don't mean to, but
okay, I'm ready.
The question I've been dying to ask, and so I'm just going to ask it, is because it seems to be the topic today, is for the folks who are saying, you know, we need to ban trapping, or trapping closures are the thing. My question to you would be, is that a full closure, full ban on federal lands only? Is that the only outcome that can be marked as successful? Or is that a scalable request? Because I feel like if that's scalable, in that we look at closures in specific areas and we have monitoring and we have you know, timing aspects on things and pieces like that, that's where the conversations can happen, in my opinion. if we're at all ban all the time and we can't move off of that, I don't know where we're going to go from that, but I feel like if we can get to a scalable conversation, that's where we can maybe find some middle ground, find some parameters that we can work with. And so just going to throw that out there, and hopefully I didn't just hand you a grenade with that, Jamie. Sorry.
It didn't feel like a grenade at all, Amy. Brian?
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, my comments are still about just process. I'm not going to try to get into the merits of closure or no closure. And I think that was good, Amy, to throw out what I think is a constructive question. And I have an answer for that, but I'll save it for now. I did want to respond a little bit to what Commissioner Hyde said, which is I totally get the point that, in all likelihood, we're going to have a contentious conversation and people are going to be kind of where we thought they were. What's the point of that? I'm not entirely sure that that's where it'll go, but there's good reason to think that is where it will go. And to me, there are still reasons to have that conversation. One is I just think a number of participants just are not going to feel satisfied with the process until we do. And I do think, as I mentioned earlier, some time's gone by. I'm not totally sure everyone's in the same place. Maybe there's some new science. There have been some policy changes, including the ocean climate change policy, and yeah, maybe some explanation from the drafters could be helpful on that. I also liked what Kevin Blakely had to say about ODFW is interested in this work group discussion and wants to hear people's rationale. Maybe they've heard it all before, but maybe there are some more refined or more precise or better points around the closure issue. And I just think, at the end, I assume that what comes out of this is some kind of a report. I can't imagine it wouldn't say that we took this on and this is what happened. And just as a suggestion, process-wise, I don't know that this needs to be the whole process, but I would just throw out the possibility that you do a round robin like we started today with, where everyone has a chance to say pro or con on closure, why not? And then to Amy's point, partial, why not? And then everyone is sort of, I think, had their chance. And in terms of, you asked for what questions we might put up to discuss some of these suggestions. And I guess the question I would put up around the closure issue is, there's a lot of reason that I think everybody agrees beavers can have many beneficial effects on watersheds and watershed health. And, there's some arguments about whether closing hunting and trapping would affect the beaver population and whether that would affect the number of beaver dams. But I guess what I would kind of ask as a question is, what do we have to lose with a closure? What is the downside? There's reasons to think it could do a lot of good. What do we have to lose? And I understand, some people are going to lose the opportunity for recreational trapping on a portion of the land that's available for that. There's still public land that's state-owned and private land where that can happen. And it's, as I understand it, not a big crowd of people. So I'd like to hear kind of more about what the downside is to doing that. And then, but I especially since I think that the construction of a closure could carve out the nuisance issues that were discussed earlier as something we have to think about and how to leave room to address those, either on federal lands or off federal lands. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Brian. I'm going to skip to Greg because he has to leave in a couple minutes. And so I'm going to skip to Greg, and then Sam, I'm going to jump over to you.
Yeah, thanks. And my apologies for letting me cut in. I just want to comment on Jimmy's comment and just say that I'm all for having as much buy-off at as many levels of government as possible. I think that's always a good thing. I assume that a regional voice would be sufficient. So we have regional land managers on this committee, and that, for instance, I would need to go to the secretary's office, either agriculture or interior, to get a sign off on what we're doing here in Oregon. And I'm also worked in government long enough to know that, our regional managers are not going to speak out of turn. that they would not incite the ire of their superiors. From what I've heard from him, they've been very deliberate and very data-based on their comments and being very careful. And I've known as a public servant and working for the Forest Service, I'm not going to say just whatever comes off the top of my head. So anyway, just to say, I think that our regional folks can be doing a good job. And I feel that they have the authority to be here and to actively participate and be listened to. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Greg. Samantha?
Either
Sam
one.
B?
No, that's great that you touched on that, Commissioner Woolley. No, I was going to say, usually when I write comments and APHIS issues in EIS or a FONSI, they generally defer to the state and how the state manages wildlife when considering predator damage management and other factors. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity for us to convey different management options to federal agencies. And then lastly, I think Amy's idea is great. Let's talk about scalable, let's talk about closures. And I would love to do a round robin like Brian suggested. I think it'd be useful to take a temperature of the room and see where we all are on it. And that's all I got. Thanks, Jamie.
Okay. All right, Stan.
So I just want to kind of counter just a little bit of what was said about the federal managers. We'll go back to the petition that was originally filed. We had a letter from the supervisor of the Sayusla National Forest requesting the petition to be affirmed. That had not been, and I hope Josh will weigh in, that had not been ran through region, nor had it went to DC. That was an independent action. And as a matter of fact, on the contacts that I had in both DC and in region, they were totally unaware of that. So I just want to have that cautionary principle out there.
Thanks, Dan. And we've got Josh following you.
Yeah, so I can confirm what that Stan said, that the Forest Supervisor in Sayusla, in working with his biologist, made that petition and then, revised it based upon further conversations with the region and the Washington office, based upon feedback during the testimony piece. And so that was definitely discussed and refined from a messaging perspective for the Sayusla. The other things I do want to highlight, the state management of game populations is very clear. That's their authority to be able to do so. But I do really think that the three areas that we highlighted as the top priority in terms of population data collection, landscape analysis to prioritize areas, and this trapping are really super interrelated. And I don't think, it would make sense to completely throw off the trapping ban discussion, or at least, a more focused discussion on areas across the state of Oregon where we have limiting factors and or other resource reasons that might warrant a closure. Darren gave a really good example in terms of translocation investments there. We want to maintain those animals where we translocate them onto federal lands and not risk loss due to trapping. And then the other one is that coho recovery, in-stream restoration piece, where we really can benefit from the presence of beaver to improve through passive restoration, aquatic conditions for listed species, for water storage elsewhere, and some other reasons. And so I think this is definitely not an all or nothing discussion. And if we pursue this population data collection, and then we really prioritize these landscapes where beaver populations are a major concern, or other resource values may trump the presence of trappers on the landscape, is something that is worthy of this group discussing, and to try and kind of refine the all or nothing approach to really targeted resource-based issues that might warrant a consideration for a temporary ban in trapping. Thank you.
Thanks for that. So we're at about 3:45, and there are no more hands up. I really appreciate people just starting to weigh in on this topic. Chris, I'm going to go ahead and go to you, and then I want to summarize where I think we are and make a proposal for next steps. Chris?
Yeah, sorry for getting in there late. I don't think it's a hand grenade, to use Amy's analogy, but we've been talking about scaling trapping closures. So just in the way I tried to flip the management tool of closures versus trapping, I think we can also have an alternative approach to the question of trapping closures. Right now, the default is open to hunting and trapping unless individual federal land management entities to ask for or institute an activity ban on their lands. Another perspective that's still active management, that requires data collection, that requires putting together a plan and ask for a decision, but is an inverse of the current situation, is having beaver hunting and trapping closed everywhere on federal lands and have requests for opening be made to the commission based on data collection, based on the availability of appropriate opportunities in that watershed or forest or district. I'm not sure what the scale would be. So it's the same situation where you have a request, but in this case, the sort of the management paradigm is just flipped. It's active management. It's thinking about populations. It's thinking about habitat. And so that's not thinking about this way, hasn't been in our in our conversation. And I don't know whether it should be, but it's just an alternative way of thinking about how to do. It's not arbitrary. Have it be an active, users groups can be engaged in actively in that process that ODFW and the land managers have to actively be managing and considering openings.
Thanks, Chris. That's an interesting suggestion that hasn't come up yet, looking at it flipped. Stan, I see your hand up.
That's ORS 496012. It's one of the 7 co-equals of wildlife management policy set by legislative edict that ODFW must follow. And it'll be one of those, Chris. The burden isn't on those who want to hunt. It's the mission of ODFW under 496012 to provide equitable utilization and also to make sure that we have good protection of all of our resources that will allow that. So I think that's a flip, but also I think the legislature probably have something to say about that.
Thanks for that clarification, Stan. So again, we're at 3:45. I think that we should, it looks like we're at a bit of a lull for this. So here is what I suggest. So we've got, our next meeting is December, help me Sam, 6th?
I believe so, yeah.
Our next meeting is December 6th. We did send out a poll for people to give us their information about dates in January and a possible date in February. The group at our last full meeting said that they thought the subgroup had value to help sort and synthesize and advance concepts for the large group to consider. And so the subgroup is still on board to do that. And the subgroup can meet after this meeting and make sense of the conversation that we had and bring forward some ideas for the large group to consider. So those are some process pieces that are in play. What I propose to all of you is that our December meeting, we take that deeper dive, as so many of you have. Oh, it's the 8th. Thank you. Thanks, Sam. It's December 8th is our next meeting. That our next meeting, we take a part of the meeting to take a deeper dive on this, on the question of the limits or closure of trapping. We stepped into the conversation now, so the homework for everybody would be to really think through, given all the information that you've received to date, given where people are in the room, what proposals would you put forward about, kind of where we'll hear from everybody, what would you put forward around, closures of trapping? And so we'll spend some time on that. We can do pros and cons as Brian suggested. We can think about it as scalable terms as Amy suggested. However you want to frame it, that would be helpful. And my caution to you, and Amy can put something in the chat to to tell me if maybe I don't need to put this caution out there, but I will say it anyway. My caution is that look to the full Jamboard for that connecting tissue. Don't just stay within that one cluster. I mean, as we've talked about, there are linkages to to some of these other clusters that will help either guide where closures should happen or guide where trapping should be allowed. We've got all these questions here that would help to, some of them we don't have answers to, some of them maybe we do. And so I suggest that you come to the next meeting with some, proposals to share that aren't necessarily just you retreating to corners. So that's one. And then the second is that when you look at the rest of the Jamboard, if you're starting to see, I mean, not everybody has this, ability to look at that and say, oh, these go together, and here's a statement that I think the group should consider. But if you are interested to do that, I would suggest that you look at the full Jamboard and start to tease out for yourself. It's like, well, these go together. This might be a possible recommendation, and you can send those to Sam and I. We can bring them forward to the subgroup, and we can just kind of start sorting those and seeing, how are there statements that are starting to pull out that connect to these clusters. So those are two homework assignments that I propose that you do between now and the next meeting. One is you can send us up, those connecting comments in advance. And the second is just really thinking through the issue of the closures from the perspective everybody's brought forward, and what would you put on the table in December for us to talk about. Any thoughts or reactions to those two homework assignments and our proposal for December? Amy?
I think those are good, and I think it's a very worthwhile way to approach it. I do like what you are saying about consider the entirety of the Jamboard, and I do think it would be easy for us to get wrapped around the axle on this one topic, simply because we know it's going to be the one where I think most of us are the furthest apart on. But I do like the emphasis that you put on the fact that there's so much on the board there with these emerging recommendations and ideas that it would be folly to only focus on the one and not really dive into the other ones. So I just think we all have to keep that in mind as we go forward.
Thanks, Amy. Brian?
Yeah, so that sounds good. I just had a really quick question that would help me between meetings of Stan, I guess, in terms of the making sure I know what he believes is the statutory prohibition on what Chris was suggesting. I wrote down ORS 496.012. Is there something else that I should look at in the meantime?
Yep, go ahead, Stan.
Well, Chris was saying that, maybe I got it wrong, but it appeared to me that he was implying we had to prove that there was adequate populations, or we had to prove that a hunting season or a trapping season or a fishing season was appropriate. And that if someone contested that, then we were going to have to come in with the data that said that those populations were abundant enough that they could withstand some limited harvest. I think what Brian, the way I understand it is that we are to ensure that there's the abilities to have harvest upon populations. I think that's ODFW already has that requirement. And if they felt that there wasn't adequate populations, then a season wouldn't be proposed. And the agency is the one that proposes these seasons. So that's kind of where I'm going with that. I think what I was looking at was for us, we were have to come in and say, well, something could be open. And so maybe I misinterpreted, but that's what I got out of Chris.
No, I think you heard it the way I heard it. I just wanted to make sure I could look at what you thought precluded that in terms of policy or statute. And I wrote down that one citation, and maybe this isn't, maybe there's a better way to get that information to me, but in fact, you can email me offline. But.
You bet. Thank you. I will.
Okay.
Yeah, and Kevin, I want to give you a chance to weigh in to make sure that if there's anything to clarify with what Brian and Stan were talking about.
No, Jamie, thanks for that. Nothing really to clarify. That is, it's like Chris had talked about, a little bit of a different paradigm where individuals, request the season because the governing body, the commission, has closed them all, and you have to petition. That's definitely a different paradigm. But what Stan said is absolutely true as well. So it's trying to walk through, what the gain in that paradigm is versus what we currently have. So, but no other clarifications from there.
Thanks for that. Chris?
Yeah, I think I was just being sloppy in the defining the you or the requester. And so, yeah, you're right, Stan. It seems unreasonable burden to say that the user group would have to do the petitioning, but possibly it would be the agency, in a sense, asking to change regulations on a spatial basis based on the availability of information. So yeah, I think I was sort of loose with how that would operate, but mainly just focusing on flipping the context for managing openings rather than managing closures. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification. So Sam, Jefferson just asked the policy number that Stan is referring to. Stan, can you put it in the chat? And if you can't do it in the chat, I understand. Maybe you could email it to us and we can send it out when we send out the follow-up email to the group.
Hey, Jamie, this is Kevin. And maybe just in hearing both Stan and Chris talk that additional little bit, there's a number of other statutes that relate to the commission duties and powers, and that's really embeds what they do. And I'd suggest maybe if Chris is unfamiliar with how season setting goes, every time there are seasons, the commission basically hears on supply, has an overview of population, what status is, and that really is how those seasons are set or continued or modified. So I think that exactly what Chris said is currently embedded in the commission decision process for setting consumptive seasons, be that for recreation or commercial.
And Kevin, we can work with you to get that information to include in the follow-up email to the group after the meeting today so that everybody has that language. Okay, thank you for the thumbs up. I'm afraid I wonder if is my video am I getting choppy again, Sam? Sam?
You look good, I think.
Well, that's important. So we're at just before 4, and we've already talked through our next steps. You know what your homework is. The subgroup is going to meet. We'll send out the immediate action items to remind you what the homework is. There's also some information that Boone and Bob Bichetta sent us that they wanted us to forward about some of their initial thinking around recommendations. Our next meeting is December 8th. I can't think of anything else. Did I forget anything, Sam?
I don't believe so.
Nope. Okay, good. Well, I'm glad to gift you this 2 minutes of your afternoon. And thank you everybody for your time. This was a good and productive meeting, and I look forward to our conversation in December.
Great.
And to those on our live stream, thank you for joining us, and we're going to be signing off now. Bye-bye.